When Paul Hogan and Billy Fogarty liberated, that's the word I'm using, a painting from the Tate Gallery in London in April 1956, they believed they were making a principal stand for Ireland because this was not just any painting, it was one of the Hugh Lane collection, known in these parts as Summer's Day. The intention was never to steal the work or even to ransom it back to the Tate Gallery, but to make a point. And as the press release said, the authority for this action is the codicil to the will of Hugh Lane, dated 1915, bequeathing the 39 treasures to the city of Dublin. This action has been taken in the Irish national interest. Now, today, a gallery in Dublin carries the name of Hugh Lane, and the Hugh Lane bequest is, of course, shared between these two islands. The Hugh Lane Gallery has closed its doors for the foreseeable future, but with its beautiful home illuminated as part of Dublin City Council Dublin Winter Lights, the final podcast of the year from me looks at Parnell Square more broadly. I think Parnell Square is on the cusp of great things, with a new home of Poetry Ireland, a new city library, and a revamped Hugh Lane Gallery all on the horizon. Elizabeth Kehoe, who's the historian in residence, one of them, to Dublin City Council, and someone who has crafted a tour of Parnell Square, joined me on a walk around it. And I suppose the story of Parnell Square is the story of names that are well known in this city, for example, the man after whom the square is named, and others who are deserving of greater recognition, like the extraordinary Bartholomew Moss, a subject I hope to return to on the podcast next year. It's easily walkable, and the square is centrally important to the story of the Irish Revolution, but more broadly, I think it holds a really important place in Irish cultural history, and I think it will be a good thing for Parnell Square and the North Side more broadly when that cultural quarter comes into its own. The Hugh Lane is lit up in a collaboration with the French Embassy. The title is Reimagine and Regenerate, and some of the works draw on the collections of the Hugh Lane Gallery itself, but others are kind of architecturally playful, using the canvas of that building, Charlemont House. Light and Hugh Lane instantly recalls, for me, that wonderful walking LED installation outside, Julian Oppie's work, the animated figure. You might remember there was a few of them on O'Connell Street in 2008, believe it or not. Sarah, Julian, Jack and Suzanne were walking O'Connell Street in the direction of Parnell Square. But one of them has been there anyway for a long time now. And I always find myself wondering, how many steps has she taken? So I hope you enjoy this final edition of Three Castles Burning for 2025. So grateful to all of you for tuning in, especially those who support or have supported the podcast on Patreon. There's lots to come in the year ahead. Wishing you and all of yours Nulla Conna, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. No man has the right to set a boundary to the onward march of a nation. The words that joined the statue of Charles Stewart Parnell, unveiled in 1911. While many abandoned Charles Stewart Parnell, Dublin did not. And the statue would lead to the transformation of the immediate streetscape. Great Britain Street became Parnell Street, and Rutland Square, though it took longer, would become in time Parnell Square. Charles Manners, or the fourth Duke of Rutland, has faded from memory in Dublin, but in the words of historian Patrick Geoghegan, he cultivated high society and was renowned for both the quality of his dinners and the beauty of his wife. Now, like Parnell, though in very different circumstances, he died young.
Originally, you probably know, John, it was Rutland Square, named after a chap called Charles Manners, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland at the time. Now, that means he was the King's representative, so he was a top guy, and he was the golden boy of Georgian Dublin at that time. Absolutely welcomed by the elite, well loved. Died at the tender age of 33, would you believe? People said it was because of the hospitality. In other words, he probably died of the drink because he was very fond of the claret, it was said. But the square was originally called after him. And then, of course, in 1911, the statue to Charles Parnell goes up. And in 1933, the square was renamed Parnell Square after him. So you can see by that now, we can talk about Georgian Dublin, Rutland, all that that entails. And then we can move on to talk about what was happening in 1911. Well, we had Dublin Corporation becoming more nationalistic, flexing its muscles, putting up a statue to a man who essentially had caused a terrible scandal in his life, but was a fantastic parliamentarian and a true, fighter for land rights, and introduced the first Home Rule Bill. So we have a statue to that man going up in 1911. This is pre-independence, remember. And then in 1933, with us having independence here in Ireland, we have the name changes, which of course was going on all over Dublin at that time. So just standing there outside the Ambassador Theatre, we get a whole history of modern Dublin. Isn't it wonderful?
There are several iconic buildings found around Parnell Square, including the Gate Theatre that we'll get to later, and Charlemont House. We actually see Charlemont House in James Malton's depictions of the city. It was the work of the celebrated architect William Chambers. Constructed as a town residence for James Caulfield, 1st Earl of Charlemont, the building remains remarkably similar to how it appeared externally, at least in the 18th century. And it would be the city architect Horace O'Rourke who would oversee the difficult job of converting it into a municipal gallery for modern art in the 1930s. Writing about the building, the architectural and art historian Robert O'Byrne says that Charlemont House admirably represents how a building can be sympathetically adapted and extended without disrupting integrity. In other words, it is both old and new. And Charlemont House, he notes, was intended to be an important building in its own right and to be the centrepiece of the large development then underway and today known as Parnell Square.
It was called Charlemont House, and it was built by a fellow called James Caulfield. He was a politician and a cultural man in the 1700s, and he had the house built by his architect was William Chambers. Now, William Chambers had also designed his house out in Marino, which is no longer there, but the casino in the Marino was there. And the house is different from all the other Georgian houses in the square because it looks like a villa. It's got that Palladian style that you'll see in Roxburgh House, you'll see in Strokestown, you'll see in Paris Court, you'll see in all those big houses, like a mini country house. And that's what it started out to be. Now, he was a very cultural man. He did the tour, or the Grand Tour, which took in places like Greece, Italy, the Ottoman Empire. And of course, he was sending back his art and his sculptures. So it's very appropriate that later in life, the house became the Hugh Lane Gallery and became the municipal gallery for the City of Modern Art. It's almost like it was waiting for Hugh Lane to come along and put the art in there.
There are endless reasons to step inside the Hugh Lane Gallery when it's open in normal times. I love the chance to explore the chaos, the glorious chaos of Francis Bacon's studio. And in the foyer is Seamus Murphy's very impressive memorial to Michael Collins. Yeah, it's a fitting square for a tribute to Mick Collins. Parnell Square was home to, amongst other revolutionary locations, Vaughan's Hotel, where Collins was frequently to be found. A flower pot in the back window told Michael Collins and his men when to keep away from Vaughan's Hotel, one source tells us. Frank Henderson would recall in his statement to the Bureau of Military History that there was a time when Republicans came to view Vaughan's Hotel as an unsafe location. I recollect being in Vaughan's Hotel subsequent to Bloody Sunday and previous to the truce for some reason or another. The premises were raided on a Saturday night before Bloody Sunday, and it was generally regarded afterwards as being a most unsafe place to be in. One of my favourite pictures of the revolutionary period was taken at Vaughan's Hotel, the wedding reception of Cork Republican Tom Barry, attended by Michael Collins, Eamon de Valera, Countess Markovich, and other leading lights of the movement. And then a famed picture from that day, Collins is deliberately avoiding facing the camera directly. But there are wonders beyond Seamus Murphy's bust of Michael Collins in the Hugh Lane Gallery. And the building carries the name of Hugh Lane, the art collector and dealer, whose collection created a legal crisis following his untimely death. For a long time, Dublin didn't seem quite sure what to do with the generous offer of Hugh Lane. In 1913, a bitter dispute raged in the city regarding the ideal location to build a gallery to display modern art. And one proposed location was a bridge gallery which would replace the historic Halfpenny Bridge. Hugh Lane even commissioned Edwin Lutyens, the celebrated architect, to make drawings for the gallery, but the Irish Independent newspaper asked readers to take this into account. The effect of such a building in blotting out the fine view westwards from O'Connell Bridge, and how out of harmony it would be with its surroundings. The debate over where these paintings could go went on and on forever until history got in the way.
We did. I mean, it was a complicated history. He was an art dealer. He was born in County Cork. He was related to Lady Gregory, so he would have been, going down to Cool Park House in Galway, and he'd have been interacting with all those people, the Yeatses and all of those movers and shakers in the literary and artistic circles at that time. So he got interested in Irish art. I mean, he was based in London, but he got interested in Irish art. He started to buy up Jack B. Yeats paintings, Orton's paintings, people like that. And he became involved with the National Gallery of Ireland. So, he was right there in the middle of it all. So he wanted to gift the Irish people with his art collection, but he stipulated that Dublin Corporation had to get its act together, basically, and provide premises for this. Now, he'd already opened up a smaller gallery in Harcourt Street, but he wanted somewhere bigger and better for it. And of course, Dublin Corporation, we all know, the bureaucracy, and he got very fed up. So he said, look, if you don't do it within 5 years of my death, you're not having it. Unfortunately, he did die on the Lusitania in 1915, I think it went down. And he wasn't expected to die at that time, and his collection was in London, and that's where it stayed for a while. There was an argument. There was a codicil found in a drawer in the National Gallery of Ireland where he'd left it, but nobody had witnessed it. So there was a big protracted row until eventually we said we would share the art with London. But that's really, yes, a very complicated story, very interesting story, and yeah.
To my mind, one of the finest places in the city, the Garden of Remembrance, is just across the road from the Hugh Lane. Designed by the architect Daithí Hanley, who probably best remembered in Dublin for his work in public housing. I think after Herbert Simms' 1930s Art Deco flats, Daithí Hanley's later flats, the gold wings and everything else, are the most recognisable. But there's something deeply moving about the Garden of Remembrance, because I'll always look at that archival footage of the opening of the park in 1966. Elderly men, men on crutches, one man on a stretcher. The country had a 1916 veteran as president, Eamon de Valera, and another one as Taoiseach, Sean Lamass. 50 years is a long time, but the Easter Rising was the business of young men and young women. There's a couple of things about the Garden of Remembrance. I love the pool, which is lined with mosaics of broken spears and other weapons, reflecting that Celtic custom of throwing weapons into lakes after battles. And I love the decorative railings as you walk around the exterior of the park, seeing things like Brian Boru's harp. It's really hard to imagine anything else at the site of the Garden of Remembrance, but it's linked eternally to one of Dublin's great and now forgotten heroes.
But as a historian, I do imagine it because it was originally, of course, Rutland Gardens, and we get the excuse to talk about one of my favourite men in Irish history when we talk about Rutland Gardens, and that's Bartholomew Moss. Bartholomew Moss, he was born in County Laois in the 1700s. He trained to be a surgeon, and then he went on to do something quite extraordinary for the time. He went to France and he trained to be a man midwife, and he did this because he was absolutely appalled at the conditions that women were having their babies in at that time. Now, it was all very well for the elite women. They would have been getting well looked after in their houses by midwives, surgeons, doctors, etc. But for the vast majority of ordinary women, it was a very, very different story, and the mortality rate of both women and babies was really high. He decided he was going to do something about it, and he built what was called a lying-in hospital. Now, lying-in would refer to the period of time that women would stay in the hospital after having their babies in hygienic conditions, and that would give them and the child a chance before they went back out into the city. And it actually worked. Numbers started to come down. Now, he had built that hospital over on the south side of the city in Georgia Street. So he came across here to what was waste ground at the time. And he said, look, I want to build an even bigger hospital. And he started the pleasure gardens here where we're sitting at the moment, to make the money to build his hospital. And that's what he did. And he got his friends to help. Richard Cassels, who designed Leinster House, for example, was said to have done the architecture for nothing. He put himself into debt himself to build a hospital, and he died soon after it was opened, actually. So he never really got to see it working. But millions of people, no, thousands of children are thankful to him. I'm a Rotunda baby, so I am personally thankful to him. I am told that the millionth baby is due to be born there next year. So I'm really hoping that there'll be a celebration. As you know, I do these tours all the time. I ask many Dubliners, do you know Bartholomew Moss? Very few people do. And I think we should be singing his name from the rooftops because he's a wonderful, wonderful man.
Oisin Kelly's monument of the children of Lair symbolises so much: change, rebirth, resurrection. Writing about the children of Lair, W.J. McCormack makes a really important point that while the children of Lair is a myth, not a history, it's a myth with history. And interestingly, the brilliant publicart.ie notes that the sculpture, when it went up, drew criticism on the grounds that it was not fitting that a subject from pagan legend, in this case the children of Lair, should be the basis of a public monument in a Christian country. But I really love it, and I think it's a work of art in the public sphere that people, consciously or otherwise, engage with all the time. A place of protest, reflection, commemoration, or your lunchtime sandwich.
Oisin's fantastic statue is in what would have been Bartholomew Moss's orchestra pit that he had, concerts and all kinds of things to raise money to build his hospital. But the statue itself is fabulous. It went up in 1971. The gardens themselves were opened in 1966 by De Valera to commemorate the 1916 Rising. And this went up again. It's all about evolution. It's all about change. And it is one of my favourite statues in the city. And what I like most about it is I think people encounter it by accident almost. They could be on their way, shopping. They could be just coming, workers could be coming in here to have a bit of lunch, and they'll look up and they'll think, what's that? Because it is, at first sight, you wonder, what's such a strange statue? And then hopefully they'll be encouraged to go up and look and read about it. So this is the fantastic thing about art, Donald. It's that, if it's out on the streets, people will start to interact with it.
Some of the histories on Parnell Square are more personal than the birth of a nation. Directly beside the Hugh Lane and outside what was once the National Ballroom, Let's Dance, a memorial mentioned recently on the podcast when we talked about the Miami show band specifically. But in a sense, I think that monument to the Miami is also a monument to the show band era more broadly. As well as the National, the square was home to the Irene and more besides. Now, one thing Elizabeth does in her job as historian in residence is oral histories, and time again, for Dubliners of a certain generation, Parnell Square comes up, and Parnell Square meant dancing.
I talk about that. One of the other things I do, as you know, is oral histories. And when I'm asking people about, what you do with your first wage packet, the first they'd say to me, I had to give up most of it to my mother, and she'd give me back a few coppers. And I'd say, well, what did you spend that on? Buy a packet of fags and dancing. Dancing was the big thing here in the 40s, 50s and 60s. There were dance halls all over the square, which again, we're talking about, repurposing the buildings. Now, the architects who built these built them for the elite. They wouldn't have any conception that eventually they'd be turned into dance halls. Can you imagine? For the common people. And it's wonderful. And it's built that statue to the Miami Band show band who were tragically killed in the 1970s, coming back from a gig in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, is outside what used to be the National Ballroom, which of course had thousands of people open 7 nights a week. People like Dickie Rock, all of those big show bands played in there, all live music every night. And some of the men and women would have been in there almost every night. It was a huge pastime. And of course, we had the Iron over on the east side. We had the Teachers Club over on the west side, more dance halls. So Dublin was dancing the night away during those times.
On one corner of the square, we find the Findlater Church. Well, Dubliners call it the Findlater Church, but historically it was known as the Abbey Church, the Abbey Presbyterian Church, a Gothic-style church that finally, free of scaffolding, for the first time in 18 years, that building was covered up. In her definitive architectural history of Dublin, Christine Casey describes it as a large and flamboyant, decorated Gothic church paid for by Alexander Findlater, a successful Dublin merchant whose name it still bears. It is French in much of the detail and in the slender elegance of its spire, which very effectively closes long vistas from Mountjoy Square and from O'Connell Street. But she makes the point, the interior is rather a disappointment by comparison. The church has history and the church has lore.
I mean, it's such an interesting church, and again, the whole history of the square you can follow the whole history of the square by just the names of that church. It's called the Abbey Church, was called the Rutland Church as well, and it's known to Dubliners as Findlater's Church, and it was built in the mid-1800s. Now, after it was actually on the site of what was a perfectly good Georgian house, number 17, but Findlater got permission to build his neo-Gothic church, and it is very fancy, very ornate, and the story goes, I don't know how true this is, but I have heard this from another tour guide. The story goes that when he unveiled it to the Presbyterian population here, who wouldn't be known for their love of frills and fancies and florid architecture, they said, "Oh no, we don't like that at all." He said, "Well," he says, "if you don't like it, I'll give it to the Catholics." They said, "No, we'll have it. We'll have it." So there you go. And interestingly enough, next door, it is a neo-Gothic building, as you know, but I love the fact that it's on the Georgian Square for the pure quirkiness. And one more story about that. Next door, the Jemisons live, from the distillers. And if you look there's 4 gargoyles around one of the pillars of the church, and the 4th gargoyle has its head knocked off, and would have been looking into the window of Mrs. Jemison's bedroom. And apparently she said, "I'm not having that looking in," and they had the head of the 4th gargoyle knocked off for that reason. So there you are, Donald. If you have a bit of money, you can get a neo-Gothic church built on the side of the square, Georgian Square, and you can also get the head knocked off a gargoyle.
Soon, number 11 Parnell Square will be home to the Poetry Ireland Centre. I think that will be a brilliant addition to the square. The Irish Writers' Centre is nearby, and I think those 2 institutions will operate in a great sense of harmony, promoting Irish writing. But one of the more peculiar monuments on Parnell Square, one that's quite overlooked now, is a monument to the Irish volunteers, pretty much across the street from the new Poetry Ireland Centre and beside the entrance to the Garden of Remembrance. It's a very overlooked monument. It could do with a little bit of TLC. And in the Irish language, it tells us that the Irish volunteers were founded in the Rotunda Rink in November 1913. Did Dubliners care? Well, 7,000 people turned up, of whom 4,500 managed to squeeze in for proceedings. Bulmer Hobson, once recalled as the most dangerous man in Ireland by British intelligence, remembered that the arrangements for the meeting in the Rotunda were made by me. I went to the Lord Mayor, Larkin Sherlock, and asked him for the use of the Mansion House. He refused. I then engaged a large concert hall in the Rotunda. This hall held only about 500 people, as at first we were too dubious of the amount of popular support we would get to risk taking a bigger room. As the day approached for the holding of the meeting, I took the Rotunda Rink, a large temporary building in the grounds of the Rotunda Gardens. The Rink was then the biggest hall in Dublin and held about 4,000 people.
And we got over 3,000 signed that night. The meeting was packed out. The Rotunda Gardens outside the hall were packed out, and right into Cavendish Square the traffic was stopped.
The Gate Theatre, previously explored in an episode earlier this year centring on Orson Welles' time in Dublin City, is a great piece of architecture. And while he was a world star, Orson Welles, other names like Peggy Cummins, Cyril Cusack and Geraldine Fitzgerald, they all paid the bills for the Gate at home. For the first 2 seasons of its existence, the Gate's plays were hosted in the Abbey's Peacock Theatre. But soon after, the architect Michael Scott succeeded in transforming this space into a theatre. And as Robert Hogan wrote in his History of Irish Theatre, the stage was small, there was little room for the storage of sets and no fly space. Despite these handicaps, the theatre's productions were the most visually exciting to be seen in Dublin. As a building, it's really beautiful, housed in a former assembly rooms built in the 1780s, And the crest, getting back to where we began, of the Duke of Rutland, fittingly enough, is visible in the building. I feel that the gate really adds to the great 18th century feeling of Parnell Square. Hilton Edwards and Micheál Mac Liammóir, who ran it, of course, were great characters. And Elizabeth has a wonderful story about Micheál Mac Liammóir.
I have a personal story about Michael McLeamore.
Yeah.
Can I tell you? Okay, right. Okay, so when I was a schoolgirl, I belonged to the drama society in my school, run by a lovely woman called Vera Gallagher. She was absolutely wonderful. But she did give us very difficult plays to do, and one of them was Saint Joan by Michael Bolt, which is a really hard play. And bear in mind, there's only one female part in the play, and of course, that's Saint Joan. We're an all-girls school, so we were all playing men. I myself was playing a stroppy priest. But in about 1974 or 5, she took us to the Gate Theatre to see the great Micheál Mac Liammóir performing, and he was doing a play. He'd written himself a one-man play called The Importance of Being Oscar, to one of his great heroes, of course, Oscar Wilde. And we were all delighted, of course. We were all in our school uniforms, and even more delighted, she took us around the back of the stage to meet the great man. Now, can you imagine? There we are in our gym slips and our knee socks, filing in. He's sitting in front of his mirror that's surrounded by lights, and he's taking off his makeup. And now you have to remember, Donald, he was very grand. And so he swept around. He said, "Hello, girls. Hello, girls. How are you?" And we go, "Hello, Mr. Mac Liammóir. How are you?" He said, "Now, tell me now, what play are you doing at the moment?" And we said, "St. Joan. We're doing St. Joan, Mr. Mac Liammóir." And he went, "St. Joan. St. Joan." And he said it, like Lady Bracknell in The Importance of Being Ordered said, "a handbag." And he was absolutely shocked at this. He said, "St. Joan has one female part. I don't know how you're going to manage that at all, girls, honestly." And we're all standing there absolutely petrified. And Miss Gallagher, our lovely drama teacher, was going bright red. But anyway, that's my memory. And I thought, how wonderful. I've never forgotten meeting that great man and seeing him. And he was fantastic in the play as well. Wonderful.
So there we have it. Thank you all so much for tuning in to the podcast over the year. We had some great guests this year, thinking back on people like Grania Shaffrey, talking about cities and towns and our built environment. Brian Kerr, reflecting on everything from Drimna to Libya. The Donnybrook Fair, the Porter Wars with Christina Wade, the history of the animal gangs, a look at Tony Gregory, and a long special on the end of Monto a century on. There's absolutely lots there in the archive for you to get stuck into. This is the last broadcast, I'm happy to say, from Radio Free Kimmage. We're moving down the road. We're moving for the last time, and this will be it for me. Hopefully Radio Rialto is where we'll be for the future. But thank you again so much for tuning in this year and for your support. Looking forward to joining you next year. Slán go fóill.
You're listening to Radio Free Kimmage, broadcasting live from sunny South Dublin.